Avoiding hard conversations, costing you more than you think. Avoiding the short-term pain obviously just kicks the can down the road and increases the long-term consequence.
My attempt to have the other person not feel a certain way is my own attempt to retain control and to essentially control and manipulate the other person's emotions.
By not communicating your truth, your needs, your values, the freedom that you want up front, not only is that actually lying by omission, but you are actually upsetting them in the long run. Avoiding the hard conversations or avoiding conflict specifically creates it. Greg, avoiding hard conversations, costing you more than you think. I think big episode today, mate. I think this is one that's been on my list for a while. I think I was telling you the other day just how, I guess I'd say rampant, how significant it is with the clients I work with. And it's an interesting one, mate. You know, a lot of people that I work with, they can acknowledge early on, perhaps there's a degree of avoidance, conflict avoidance, people pleasing, again, common things I work with. But the vast majority of people I work with, mate, they are completely unaware of it. You know, they justify, it's not the right time. You know, I'm asking too much. I don't want to upset them. I'm looking after them. And then actually, as we unpack it, we find that it's actually the source of their issues. And whether it's affecting their career and asking for the pay rise, you know, their relationship, maybe they don't feel they're showing up sincerely. It is absolutely probably the most common thing I work with. Oftentimes it's not why people consciously come to me, but it is the underlying issue, avoiding these conversations and the lack of authenticity that comes with it. Initial impressions, your thoughts, can you relate? Is this surprising to hear? Talk to me.
Yeah, well, I'm glad we're having a conversation around this because I can finally bring up something I've been meaning to talk to you about. No, I'm joking.
I was going to say that to you.
No, having difficult conversations is hugely relatable to me, having been, I'd call myself a recovering people pleaser. So as someone who is trying to make things feel okay and to do right by people, this is a massive topic. And I think for myself is, you can tell yourself all kinds of, I'm the nice guy, I'm keeping the peace. This is good for everybody because, you know, I'm not rocking the boat, all the different things that you can tell yourself. And I identify as well with the bigger cost that it can come with as well. Maybe for me personally, resentment can build up over time, whether that's at work and you I should be getting paid more, or this project's not going well, if only I had spoken up earlier, or whatever's going on, or in a relationship, you feel like you're sacrificing what matters most to you, but maybe hadn't realized that. It's the sort of thing that happens over time, and maybe only when it gets to a chronic stage that you feel you need to say something, or when, you know, things really get to a stage that they're not working anymore, or you're reactive, and then you end up having the conversation. So,
but having the conversation reactively with emotions, right? Which we'll get into today isn't necessarily the optimal way to do it. So who is today's episode for? I think, I mean, we touched on it just there. I'll expand on that a little bit. I mean, I think the most obvious one is, you know, your partner, your husband, your wife, relationships as a whole. But then equally, you know, your boss, your colleagues, your friends. I mean, ultimately, any conversation you're avoiding, you're just kicking the can down the road, right? And as I sort of alluded to earlier, what I will regularly find with clients, and frankly, it's just a fact, is you're actually, you know, you can't avoid conflict in life, right? I mean, I think conflict sounds like it has a negative connotation, but, you know, even if we said, all right, you and I get on well, we're good friends, there's going to be conflicts in different opinions, you know, there absolutely will be. And I think often we treat that as this thing to be avoided and that we need to be on the same page, we need to keep the peace. But actually, you know, having the same opinion as, you know, if you were just a clone of me, I don't think there'd be that same value in the relationship and growth. So this sounds like this is something that you've had a bit of a journey with. I'd love to maybe start with that, Greg.
Yeah, absolutely. Just on the point you were just saying, I think there's sort of the idea as well with, say, when a coach on a sports team stops talking to you, that's the time that you should be worried. The idea that as long as they see potential, as long as they're willing to have the conversation, even though it's challenging, about drawing out your potential or whatever that is, then that's a healthy thing, as opposed to it's just reframing, oh, you know, the coach is talking to me again, I must be doing stuff wrong. But the fact that and that's slightly different with a coaching relationship, but similar idea, I think, same with a relationship. If you're no longer talking about things that where there's a conflict or where something could be better, that should be an alarm bell as well.
Yes.
That what have you given up on things being better or being different or getting on the same page? So yeah, to answer your question, I've definitely had a journey with it. I think the previous idea that not having conflict being the goal for a lot of people pleasers, I think that is the goal, or wanting to have a more pain-free or a more relaxed,
right?
Just to avoid discomfort. And you can see it as a path to that. Hey, where can I let go of things so that I am less bothered, as opposed to asking the question of, what matters most to me? How do I communicate that? And the fact that having conflict in a healthy way is actually good and can improve the relationship is definitely a new thing for me, where I think you otherwise gear your whole life around avoidance.
Yes.
But it comes out in other ways. It comes out either in conversations to other people. It comes out, in a work environment, it would be the water cooler conversation because you didn't speak up at the meeting. It's the fact that you're not actually on board with stuff. It's the agreeing in person. But you're asked to sit down, but you're standing up on the inside. So you externally agree, but internally you disagree, and what that causes at work. And then same in a relationship. You go, I'm fine. This is okay.
It's not a big deal.
Not a big deal. Yep, I'm doing this for them. And my wife and I had a time a number of years ago where we hadn't had a conversation around things where we were out of alignment for quite a while. But we were both giving up on things that mattered most to us because we were calling it love. We were calling it for the other person. But over time, it actually felt like resentment. I can't be who I am and live the way that matters most to me because I have to love you in this way, or I'm choosing to. So it wasn't from a healthy place until we started going, what's working, what's not working, how are you actually doing, what do you actually value? And it led to a bunch of conflict. But it was so healthy. And so, that was a surprising time as well, going, oh, this conflict feels really healthy because we're actually having an honest conversation around what matters.
And even if it's, sorry to interrupt there, Greg, but even if it's uncomfortable in the moment, because I think that's also, let's be real, right? Even if it's uncomfortable in the moment, the end outcome, whether that's relief after the conversation, clarity on knowing where they stand, or simply a deeper understanding and connection the next day, where have we sort of unknowingly take on that avoiding discomfort is the goal? If we were living that way in all areas of life, we wouldn't start the business, we wouldn't have kids, we wouldn't look at delaying gratification and saving, right? So it's such a great topic, I think, today, because so often, we like to think we're switched on, or, I might work with some intelligent clients, and in many regards, they're self-aware. They can see the cost or the discomfort required to achieve their long-term goal with their business or with their kids and the sacrifices. But then in this realm here, they are perhaps unknowingly not recognizing how much they're putting their own fear or their own discomfort, their own unbearable feelings first. Okay, so I think that's the key thing. And I know before the show, because we're having a brief discussion about where we could go, there's a lot to this topic. So I think there's also the distinction perhaps between conscious awareness to, look, I struggle to avoid these conversations or struggle to avoid, conflict when it's negatively associated. But then I think there's also, today speaking to the people who perhaps today might be a bit of an eye-opener that unconsciously there's been a lot of blocks around avoiding conflict. I think I told you a couple of weeks ago, I was recently working with another coach, and sort of session one, he was saying, no, Hayden, I'm absolutely willing to have hard conversations with people, mate. I do it for a living, know, and first of all, maybe that's true in a particular realm. I mean, this person being a executive coach, he was, he is able to, she actually, was able to do it in a realm where, they had control, they didn't have to share that same level of vulnerability. And then at home with their partner, there's a different sort of level of vulnerability required, right? Let alone, her own individual traumas and associations around, her father and what those hard conversations meant. And so, for this particular client, and they don't mind me sharing this story, it was quite an eye-opener to realize in certain areas of their life, they can hold people accountable, they can have the hard conversations, But when it came to vulnerability in their intimate relationship, that was actually a different story. Okay, so I think I would be thrilled today if perhaps there was some eyes being opened in terms of actually how and why we're avoiding the hard conversations, the conflict. Because in many times, just to flesh that out a bit more before we move on, Greg, and many times we just hide behind, I don't want to upset them, are my needs reasonable? A number of things we just hide behind, right? And I think we can, perhaps that is the narrative or the story we give ourselves. And maybe there's some truth in that. Maybe we don't genuinely want to upset them. But is there actually a deeper motivation to avoid our own wounds? And in fact, I guess the bigger question of today is, are we upsetting them or ourselves more in the long run by looking at the short-term avoidance?
Yeah, we're talking about that before the show, the long-term cost of avoiding the short-term pain. This kind of the fact that we get to not have the conversation in the moment, but there's something else that's happening. That we're building up that resentment, or the relationship is not what it could be, or at work that, work is not as it could be, or we're not living out our values, all of those different things.
Yes.
And so I imagine the reasons that we give are different. There's lots of different reasons on why we're saying, I'm not having that conversation because it's better for the relationship, it's better for them, it's better for me. But actually that can be a smokescreen, like you're saying, that actually there's another reason we're avoiding it. Do you find that is really similar? Like there's a similar avoidance, or is it different for every person on what they are trying to avoid? That's not, they give the reason, but then underneath they're actually avoiding something else.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, it is so unique, so different, and it was interesting almost in me thinking some perhaps analogies or stories that I almost struggled because there wasn't one key theme, But look, in many cases, probably the most common one is, could be fear of rejection. Frankly, right? I think we've all had challenging experiences where we might feel that our needs are too much, or that we were disowned, or a part of us was rejected. Whether that's true or not, that's often the story or the association we can carry from childhood or school bullying, etc. And of course, it can be very, very dynamic and very sort of sneaky, very deceptive in terms of the ways it plays out. I had a client a couple of years ago I was working with, and he came to me looking for clarity in terms of his relationship, in terms of if he wanted to get married. So specifically, his partner was saying, look, we've been together, 3 or 4 years. What are we doing here? We've got a great relationship, but the clock's ticking. Are we going to get married? And when we started to sort of break down this individual's needs, what we found is that they weren't obviously communicating. And specifically, what I should have said first, is that they felt that they didn't have the freedom in the relationship for their other values, their golf, their other hobbies, their friends in the relationship. And, when we broke down why that was, and it took a while to get there, what we actually uncovered was that growing up, this particular client, he had vivid memories of trauma around when his father left his mother, and he would see his mother being just so upset, so distraught. And really from that time onwards, there was this sort of unconscious association of, I always want to make my partner happy, right? And again, we did an early episode on happiness, right? On, is happiness the goal versus sort of long-term fulfillment, which I think is very relevant here, right? But in this instance, this particular individual was avoiding any possible conversation where they could be on the same page with, because that idea of seeing someone that he loved upset was such an unbearable feeling to him. And so, one confronting conversation, ironically, I had with this individual is, whilst we sort of uncovered that trauma relatively early on, he would still feel, well, yes, I've been through this trauma, and yes, that was hard for me, but equally, well, why would anyone want to upset their partner? And I think it was a huge breakthrough for this client specifically to recognize that by not communicating your truth, your needs, your values, the freedom that you want up front, not only is that actually lying by omission, but you are actually upsetting them in the long run. In fact, specifically, his partner, I think, literally referred him to come and see me because she was so upset she didn't know where she stood in the relationship.
Right.
And so literally by him trying to avoid upsetting, his partner, he is upsetting her in a more long-term way where it was really the number one conflict they had, right? And so I wonder how much, the audience can perhaps think about their own version of that, because simply avoiding the hard conversations or avoiding conflict specifically creates it.
Yeah.
And at the absolute minimum, the conflict, we avoid it externally, but it becomes internal, right? Creating our own anxiety, overwhelm, sense of lack of fulfillment.
Yeah.
Does that resonate with you, Greg? I can sort of see you.
Yeah. There's I think the way it was described to me that was helpful, where I had done that a bunch, and I think a lot of people do it as well, is realizing that my attempt to have the other person not feel a certain way is my own attempt to retain control and to essentially control and manipulate the other person's emotions. So when it was put in that frame where I say, no, I'm doing this for them, realizing, no, you're doing this for you because you have an unbearable feeling about how they might respond if you were to be honest. So you are trying to pre-decide how they should feel and then acting accordingly to maintain that emotion in them. So you are robbing them from the ability to genuinely respond to who you are and what you genuinely think. So you are controlling them or attempting to control them. And through that lens, you go, oh my gosh, like that is, who would want to be in a relationship where, you're consistently feeling like they are trying to manipulate and control you. And so, and also realizing that you are not giving them the opportunity to be in a relationship with you. You are giving them the opportunity to be in a relationship with a version of you that you are presenting that you think they want or you think they should want because they should never be upset.
Yes.
Basically, you're not giving them, I will be me. How you respond is your responsibility. You can be you. This sort of retaining ownership of I am me, you are you. We choose to be in a relationship versus this. And I think people pleasers suffer with this a lot, or rescuers, people that get into helping industries, all that sort of stuff. There's a blurring of me and you, and I try and become you or the people I'm helping and serving.
Yes, or I see myself in you.
There's this over-empathizing and trying to rescue. And so there's a lack of definition between this is me, this is what I need, this is what I think, this is what I feel. But equally, I want you to think and feel and be apart from me so we can, as whole people, be in a relationship through choice, as opposed to, I don't really know where I end and you start, in a lack of sovereignty. So that was a big thing for me to realize, that the attempt to maintain a consistent emotion in the other person comes from my own inability to sit with an emotion or be rejected potentially. What if I'm honest and they choose to not be with me? What if I share what I truly think and it doesn't go the way I want? That is the vulnerability and risk of genuine relationship. But the flip side is, it was helpful for me to realize you're not losing anything, because what you have right now is a fake relationship.
Unsustainable.
You have a representative relationship, and maybe you're both doing it. And I think that's why people also talk about the honeymoon phase of a relationship. You're both presenting, maybe not intentionally, you're not trying to trick anyone, but you are wanting the relationship to go well. And so you are being a version of yourself. It can be a bit to get back in touch with that if you haven't done it for a while. I imagine people working with you would realize, oh, this is what I really want, or this is what I really think, sometimes seemingly for the first time, or the first time in a long time, because you don't ask those questions when you're trying to not experience pain.
Absolutely. And further to your point, often we are showing parts of ourselves that are sincere or authentic, but perhaps we're overemphasizing those parts and suppressing the other parts, right? And there was a quote I heard the other day, which I think is very relevant here, which is, suppression of expression leads to depression, right? And I think that's, and then we could argue, the depression or the low mood, the lack of fulfillment then leads to escapism, scrolling, alcohol, to avoid that, seek pleasure or comfort as an offset. But so look, it runs very deep for many people. And actually, in fact, just to sort of round off that story a little bit and even, preempt where I'd love the listeners to be going today, going back to that sort of case study I shared with that client from a number of years ago, what ended up happening with the individual is, so we spoke about they were avoiding this very short-sighted, avoiding their metric was, I don't want my partner to be upset in the short term, which was creating them being upset in present day and in the long term because they didn't know where they stood with the future of the relationship and marriage. But post us working together, when the individual actually was able to let go of that trauma, or at the very least, and partly for the goal of listeners, to see the impact that was having and the costs of that strategy, because remember, to the degree that we're stuck in that mode is the degree that we are perceiving, at least unconsciously anyway, that there is benefits to this strategy, right? So, again, this client had this very sort of noble, I wouldn't want to upset them, I'm being a good provider, etc. But at the same time, the cost of that is he's now questioning, do I want to be in the relationship? It's coming at the cost of my freedom. But the resolution was, for this individual, they had the hard conversation. The wife was upset, but not for that reason. The wife was upset that her partner felt so unfulfilled in the marriage and that he couldn't go out to see his friends, that he felt so terrified or avoidant of actually asking, she's thinking, God, am I that scary? And he had to actually own, babe, it's not actually about you. It's about, it's about my own wounds here, my own associations.
Yeah.
And so it's hopefully such a great case study that for this individual, whilst it was a hard conversation and whilst he did struggle being transparent with, I think the wife shed some tears that she was upset that, God, I'd never want you to not be able to be yourself or to not see your friends. But the alignment that came during that conversation and more importantly, immediately after was huge, right? So I think what a narrative shift in terms of, she's upset, that's the nightmare scenario, to she's now upset, but now we're actually getting to the real problem, right? Because avoiding the short-term pain obviously just kicks the can down the road and increases the long-term consequence, but actually relative to what matters, our values, not the short-sighted of, are they happy or not in this moment.
So for the listeners, if they're, what would you suggest is a good way for them to identify if this is happening in their life? It sounds like there might be one scenario that they're obsessing over or something that they realize, here's an area I know I should have a conversation. There might be one. And should they also, if they're realizing that it's not the story potentially they're telling themselves, that's not the truth, but there's something else holding them back, should they look for a pattern? Like, does this happen in multiple relationships? Does this happen at work as well? How does someone work out if this is them? And then I think we'll get into, what's going on underneath.
Yeah, well, I think that the obvious question they need to start with is, trying to identify, as you've said, is there a pattern here? And that sounds obvious, but as we've sort of alluded to earlier, that can be quite hard to quantify, especially if maybe we're a manager or a CEO, and so we can have the hard conversations with our staff, but it's on our terms, or we're the authority figure, right? And so that we could very easily say, no, I can have hard, vulnerable conversations in this realm, but that doesn't necessarily represent the personal relationships, right? So I look for many clients I work with, they just struggle with all hard conversations or any form of perceived conflict. For others, it's very sort of deceptive, very slippery. It's just in a key area. So I think the first one would just be, as obvious as it sounds, Greg, really challenging yourself today where could I relate to this? Is there a version of this for me? What is that pattern? Be it in in multiple areas of your life, or be it in one particular area of your life. Because I think even if you were to pinpoint it down and have the insight of, okay, maybe I'm not one of those people who are sort of conflict avoidant in general, but certainly in my relationship, I do tend to always go, well, now is not the right time. Well, I don't want to upset her. Well, maybe my needs are too much. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I don't know what I want, etc. Maybe the start of growth for a listener in that situation today is recognizing that, maybe in a particular sort of niche area of their life, they're always coming up with a different story why now is the wrong time to have the conversation, right? A common one that I see is a lot of clients that might have associations around them being wrong or getting it wrong, or perhaps their father told them this was the wrong way to do it, or you're bad, you're wrong, etc. And so, the other sort of perhaps key example I could give is, many individuals, we carry the self-doubt, right? The self-doubt or fear of criticism. And so that can also be another hugely powerful incentive or benefit, frankly, of avoiding that conversation. But again, is that a benefit in the long term, or is it just a benefit to our unbearable feelings right now? So again, we come back to it's actually more about us than the noble story, we might say. And again, short term versus long term. But without digressing again, Greg, and covering those main key ideas, I think looking at what is there a pattern here? And I would almost suggest if anyone looks deep enough, they'll find there is a pattern. We said earlier that there's not, or I sort of proposed earlier that there's not particularly one key reason or dynamic that people tend to avoid hard conversations. This tends to be very multidimensional, rejection, abandonment, self-doubt, et cetera, et cetera. So I think, looking at what is under the hood, and is there a wide pattern in your life, or is it in one particular niche area? Looking at what is the story that you sort of layer over top that you may sort of convince yourself, and maybe there's some truth in that. But if you're always finding yourself putting off the conversation, that's the story, not the real motivation.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. And I think if just a personal thing that came to mind when you said, is there a pattern? Is there something that's going on for me? Or in general for the listeners, having someone sometimes in your life, whether that's you through coaching. I had that the other day with my wife where I said, hey, I'm thinking of doing this. And she looked at me and said, you always do that. I said, what do you mean? She said, when this happens, there was something in business. I said, like, this has happened in business, and so I'm going to do this. She literally said, you just said the other week that you were going to do this, but as a result of feeling stressed, feeling the certain way, you're reverting back to what you just said you weren't going to do. My initial reaction was defensiveness, like, no, I don't. But, you
don't know what I've been through.
You don't know me. I mean, you don't live with, we've been married 12 years. So she's, I've seen some patterns. And so that was actually confronting but helpful, where she was able to say, you do realize this is a pattern, right?
But what a great example, Greg, because I think what you're alluding to there is, in that moment you have a story or a narrative, or
it felt like the first time to me, but she was like, this is a variation. Exactly. It felt fresh, and it felt like, when fear has reasons, the fear gives logic. And I was, this sounds so logical. So I was wanting to share, here's the very practical plan. She essentially goes, you do realize that's fear speaking, right? Like, you do realize this doesn't make sense. Yeah. And I was like, no, it's really logical. She's like, this is just another variation. It sounds different, but it's, totally.
Oh, well, shout out to Laura today.
Thank you.
But look, I think keyword there that really resonates with me actually, Greg, is like variation, right? So, even you value growth. I would say you're a very self-aware individual, but even then for you, having that partner as a mirror, perhaps there was a reaction or a defensiveness or a trigger. But again, what's beneath that? And equally, if you were coming from a place of certainty and logic, I would suggest there wouldn't actually be that initial pushback, right? There wouldn't be that same emotional response. And whilst that's normal, human, understandable, again, if there's an emotional response, what is behind that? So long-term costs, Greg, what comes to mind for you, bringing all this together, just to really, really what I'm trying to do here is I think a lot of individuals today will be thinking, okay, I can see myself in this. I can see the stories and the way that I mask it, the way that I may have previously sort of convinced myself it's more about them and being noble or putting their needs first, when really it's representing, our own pain points and avoidance. What I want to do now, sorry to the audience, is I want to flesh this out more so they really see the cost to this. Yeah. So, has there been situations in your life or anything that you see with any of your coaching clients about how, I've proposed a lot today, how it actually compounds the issue. Yeah. Is that anything you can relate to about how it's not just an issue for tomorrow, it is truly a bigger issue for tomorrow?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think the thing that mainly comes to mind is the overall cost of a lack of fulfillment. If I were to say a broad bucket of fulfillment and resentment, and that can be resentment towards yourself long term, it can be resentment towards life, can be resentment towards the business that you're running or people, all of that. but it's sort of like the short-term pain is avoided, but the long-term bill that will be paid in the future is massive. So yeah, with the people that I work with, it's typically business owners, fathers, people that have relationships that they care about, and then they will be frustrated at the tension between what the business is requiring of them and then the way things are playing out in their relationships with their health, with other things that they say really matters to them. So the resentment and the lack of fulfillment normally is directed inward first. It's a frustration with self. It's a resentment towards self. It's realizing that they are not able to do things in a way that matters most to them. And it starts to then go outward, frustration towards the business, a frustration towards relationships, and that then flows outward. Yeah, but I think that something that's come to mind is, I think it's Carl Jung's quote. I won't say it correctly, but children have to bear the unlived lives of the parent. This idea that the unlived life of the parent is a weight that the children have to endure. So this idea that if you don't live fully, if you don't live out your values, if you don't live a path of fulfillment, and we're saying in this, it is going to require conflict. It's going to require challenging conversations with yourself, with others, with whoever that is. There is a cost to relationships, whether you know it or not. And so I think that's a big part.
That's not just your children there in that context, right?
Sure.
It's any relationship of you not fully expressing yourself.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think that while that wouldn't be realized by people that I work with, they're feeling the weight of that. Me not living out what I truly believe and what I actually feel to be true is having implications across all of my life and all of my relationships. So,
well, your own irritability, your own low mood, your own self-sabotaging patterns that you previously said, where's the discipline here? But actually that's a escapist behavior because you're unfulfilled, because you're questioning the relationship, because you're not having the hard conversations. One thing that I want to make sure I want to cover just very quickly, Greg, is, the word for me that sort of resonates here is build up. Oftentimes I might be working with an individual and they'll say, but Hayden, I've had the hard conversations and we're just not on the same page, or it just doesn't go well. And partly that's a separate conversation, perhaps for another episode on how to have those conversations or what that looks like if you're not on the same page. But the message here is almost always what I then find is we push down our needs. It's sort of we don't communicate, and then when we do, it comes out with all of this heightened emotion, right? So whether it's, you never listen to me, or it's always got to be your way, or whether it's maybe we communicate our truth somewhat objectively, but there's this real contempt with it, or this underlying resentment. And so you then have to think, well, as much as, okay, you are having the hard conversation, to be fair, avoiding the conflict has certainly escalated the emotional intensity there, right? And then what you'll almost always find, it's almost like a sick joke, is your partner will have the opposite sort of response. So they will avoid, or they will back down, and now they won't be as collaborative in the conversation itself. And so, sometimes when I do have clients who I'm sort of trying to pigeonhole them with I corner them a little bit to see how much they're avoiding the conversations is essentially ruining their life, their relationships. They'll say, Hayden, I do have the conversations. I'll say, right, give me an example of it. And then we find very quickly that actually they avoided it to a certain point. And then, yes, to be fair, they did have it, but it came out with all this emotion, right? And then to be fair to the partner could think, well, they're always angry at me. It just does not set up an equitable relationship where we can actually both be vulnerable and communicate our needs. It's almost just an argument, perhaps, right? So does that make sense, Greg? Hopefully I haven't.
Yeah. I was going to say something different, but I just had a personal example, and I don't think Laura will mind me sharing because it shows me being the one who's not doing this well. But we've had multiple conversations where Laura would end up in tears through no fault of her own, but I would be very intense in my conversation, where I would be wanting something from her, but I would have not been thinking about the best for the other person. I would say putting the relationship first. I would be thinking about, I need this, and I need it so much that I'm going to communicate it with an intensity and a consistency that it would be, hey, every 6 months or 12 months, we have this kind of big conversation. And so that part of being able to own it and to be able to not wait until it gets to that point. We used to do something relationally early on in the marriage that was helpful. It was just a weekly walk and talk. And there was when you're sitting in the car and you're having a conversation, you can feel trapped because you're right there. We can't go anywhere. Like the emotion is heightened. Or if you're having a coffee conversation, you're eyeball to eyeball, like we can't go anywhere. It can feel quite intense. So this side by side, we're going to go for a walk. There's movement. I think Steve Jobs was famous for doing a walk the block, difficult conversation.
Yes.
So you're moving. There's a sense of movement. You're side by side. There's not the sense of intensity. There's we are working together on this problem side by side. Even the physical orientation is not I am, you are the problem, which often I think to your point, when you leave it for a long time, you can feel like they are if they would just fix this, I would be okay. So they become, in your eyes, the problem. And those walk and talks were so good because it was, one person has the chance to share and the other person just listens. And it's say you get 3 minutes and it can be what's good, share all the good things, what's a challenge at the moment. And it's simply with the goal of listening to understand for the relationship. And then you're not allowed to have rebuttal or the reason why or defensiveness or get into all that sort of stuff. So yeah, I think something like that, I know it's kind of getting a little bit into a solution, but it made me think of a rhythm and a container and a way of having a conversation that allows it to be a normal thing that of course these things are going to come up.
Yes.
As opposed to I'm going to wait and there's no space for this. There's no container, there's no routine unless I forcibly bring it up and explode, which I think normally is for most of it where it just kind of something happens. There's too many shoes at the front door and things are a bit of a mess and you come home after a big day and then it was never about that, but you end up saying a whole bunch of other stuff.
Yes. And, maybe, you shared something, Claire. I'll meet you halfway with that. And a good example that perhaps I can share. And this one's a little bit different, but perhaps wise to cover. This wasn't perhaps a hard conversation with my fiancée, Krista. It was actually a small thing, but I didn't bring it up either way, right? And so the context was I'm in my office, late night, just catching up on some work before the next day. She comes in and she's communicating just how difficult the kids have been that day, right? Now, and just to be clear, I only worked this out upon reflection, right? So just for the listeners to be able to, I obviously do this for a living, but, like you, I'm human. And really the wisdom here is being able to have that level of introspection and own what's yours to make these changes long term. But so what happened is my partner Krista came in and she was just telling how challenging our son Boston was today. And I thought I did a good job in the moment. I stop what I'm doing. I put the computer down. Oh, okay, that must have been hard, etc. And I'm feeling quite proud of myself that in that moment I really stopped and was present. Okay. And so first key thing is that was about my needs in that moment, which, right? I'm wanting to be seen as this person. I'm wanting to pride myself and I'm stopping what I'm doing, etc. Now, yes, we could say that's in the relationship's best interest perhaps, but equally see that component of about my needs, which would be very easy to miss there, right? So I wanted to be the partner or the husband who can stop and be present. And so no problem, did that once, ticked. 10 minutes later, she comes in again. Oh, I tell you another thing about Boston, he did XYZ. Again, I stopped. This time I'm a little bit of tension because I'm trying to get into my work. I stop, put the laptop back down. Oh, really? Okay, XYZ, we have another conversation. I start work back up. And now, in some regards, I'm feeling even more proud of myself because I actually, again, suppress my needs even more so. And I'm this great partner,
you did it twice.
I drop what I'm there for her, etc. She comes in a third time and for better or worse, put the keyboard down again and I prioritize, connecting with her. Okay, half an hour later, we're both on the couch, we're watching Netflix and she starts speaking about something else. And I think I must have just maybe nodded my head and just kept watching my show. And Krista, quite neutrally, it wasn't a criticism, she just said, babe, just so you know, it's moments like this where I can sort of feel alone in the relationship. And I got really triggered. I basically said, are you kidding? I've been all night, whenever you've mentioned anything, I've dropped what I'm doing and I've, stopped and been present and communicated. And the moral of the story is, where was the ownership on me to actually communicate, babe, can I just have 5 minutes? If I was to do that and communicate, that isn't necessarily a hard conversation in this example, right? But it's a wise conversation to have nonetheless, right? And so, such a good example, I think, in a bit of vulnerability for me. Sorry, Krista, if you're listening, that in this instance, I'm doing this sort of, again, noble thing. I'm being the good husband. I'm feeling elated. But by me simply not being prepared to ask, at least even the second time, hey, can I just come back to this in 10 minutes and I'll be more present for you, that actually then created this build-up, right? And so whilst, I mean, hopefully a brilliant example, that didn't even have to be a hard conversation or a big conversation. But again, it was that reaction, that trigger in me, that frustration, and then what turned into a mini argument there was all of a byproduct of this story of me putting her needs first, suppressing mine, even on a minor scale. But actually, again, avoiding that conflict created a rather large unnecessary conflict at 9 p.m. one evening.
Yeah, absolutely. And an interesting one there, like someone's own perceived of aloneness is really subjective.
Yes.
So you can say, well, I've done these things, therefore, as in I feel good, so you should respond a certain way, as opposed to whatever for the other person is really important to feel felt, to feel heard, that's very subjective. I think it's just while we're on the topic of relationships and the true cost to some of that, there's a really awesome example by John Gottman, who did a bunch of relationship research, and he could tell with over 90% accuracy whether a relationship, particularly a marriage, was likely to end in divorce or separation. And they could do it just by having the people have a 15-minute conversation. They were taken to what they called the love lab and just asked them to have a conversation for 15 minutes about something that they had been disagreeing about. And they would watch how they spoke to each other, the tone, the facial expressions, the words they used, all of that. And they said that he ended up calling it the 4 horsemen, named after the apocalyptic 4 horses of the apocalypse in the New Testament. But the 4 things that they said, if these things are present when you are disagreeing about something, they are really unhealthy. So big flags to watch for. So for the listeners, I think this is a great thing just to go, do I do this or do we do this? And how could we, I think it goes into your content of how can you own your part and have less of this? But the first one was criticism. The reason I do that is because you turn it around to the other person. The other reaction is defensiveness. No, I don't. That's not what, surely I don't do that. The third one was stonewalling, which is, I don't want to talk about this. This is not the right time. I'm going to jump in the car. I'm going to go. All of these responses are massive. But there was a fourth one that they said, if this one is present, this is the biggest one to watch for, which was contempt. And I was like, well, if this is the biggest one, that's we hardly talk about contempt at all.
What does contempt mean for the listeners, Greg?
So I looked at the best description that I've heard is contempt is the experience of you have failed an interpersonal standard that I hold for you, but I am not going to step into your world to help you fix it. I expect you to fix it. And until you do, I am going to withhold love and connection.
Wow.
So what that can be experienced as is just a bit of a cold shoulder. Like you're just not quite meeting it. In a relationship, a marriage, or, a long-term partnership, you imagine there's a lot of things that we don't meet each other's standards. And if we don't talk about it, you just go, oh, it just feels a bit cold. It feels a bit off. I found that when I was in youth ministry a bunch of years ago and I read this, I thought, I hold contempt for these teenagers. They frustrate me because I have a standard of how I would love them to be living, and I think that is best for them. And just going, if they can feel, what it does is it creates a superiority and shame. So shame is there's something wrong with you, and superiority is I'm better than you. So you imagine that in any relationship, that's kind of the nail in the coffin, right? It's going, I'm above you. I'm not going to help you, but you failed, and until you fix it, I'm going to withhold love and connection. So I think if this is often just felt, it's not articulated, but that's a massive one to go. Just basically, how do you get to a place where you have humility? And I think you also want what's best for the other person, for them, and for the relationship, as opposed to sitting on your high horse of contempt and saying, you fix it, and once you do, then I'll come to the party. So it's a pretty massive one. I think it plays out in business, it plays out in relationships, plays out everywhere, but I think I've hardly ever heard contempt talked about.
Yeah.
And it's massive.
Well, that was even helpful for me to understand, that distinction, right? And I think, just to round things off today, Greg, I think that feeds into sort of my last point, or the last segment, which was more around how not having the conversations proactively, even in that minor, small example that I gave, it was such a small thing, how that actually, increases the chances of when it does come up, it's with this emotion, with this contempt, with this stonewalling, okay? Because again, the amount of clients that I have, I do have these conversations, but then when we break them down, they will say, well, okay, I am a bit short, I do get angry, I do accuse them, etc. And a big reason behind that almost always is that build-up of unmet needs, which again comes from not communicating proactively. So, these hard conversations will set you free, for lack of a better word, right? Greg, breakthrough moments, takeaways for you or for listeners today, please.
I think for me is a reminder that having a place and a space to have these consistent conversations is really important. There can be, we'll talk about it in another episode, how to initiate, how to have these conversations. There's tactics once you're in a good place to be, once you want what's best for the other person, once you want what's best for the relationship, and that's being honest, that's communicating
own your
clearly, owning your part. Then there can be tactics. Well, how do I start the conversation? How do I have the conversation? But I think realizing for me, because of the challenge of doing that, having consistent ways, if that's in business, it's reminding me that having a regular one-to-one or having a regular cadence of meeting, or in a marriage, having like a consistent time, that it's not only to bring up what's not working, it's also just talking about what's great and connecting, and a space to bring that up is something that I don't have. So my takeaway is I need to reinstigate something like that, because it's the short and it's the consistent little conversations over time, as opposed to the long build up and then there's a 3-6 month blow up of this big emotion. So that's my takeaway is don't sleep on the little conversations, notice them and have them regularly.
Yeah, no, beautiful. A couple from me. Again, your explanation is almost always not the motivation behind avoiding it, right? So we've covered that a bit today, but I think it has a nice punch to it. Your explanation is not the motivation. And then the second one I wrote here is, we didn't touch on this too much, but the conflict avoidance is a strategy. It's not your personality. It's not who you are. It's not just a case of, I'm flexible, I don't mind, I'm easygoing. Might be some truth in that in a certain context, but very almost always we've just become so conditioned to suppressing our needs. Again, that just becomes the story we tell ourselves, or the version of us we present. And then, of course, we wonder why we have these problems, or it's always got to be our partner's way, or et cetera. Or we attract the narcissist, as per last week, right? So there you go. So as you said, the avoidance isn't free. It just delays the bill. And with that, thank you for tuning in to this week's episode of Breakthrough. We absolutely will do a tactical episode, perhaps on how to actually have these conversations. I think that's something that I'd love to bring Greg into and get some frameworks of that. I know that's something he and I have talked about. Next week we have another caller question, so please look out for that. And until next time.